So in the world of cybersecurity, you've got your heroes, your villains, and then you have the enigmas. Today, we're diving into one of the most polarizing figures out there, Jonathan Scott. And just to be super clear, no, we're not talking about the guy from Property Brothers. The Jonathan Scott we're looking at is a researcher who has kicked up an absolute storm of controversy, earning both high praise and some really intense criticism for his work.
And this is the fundamental conflict, right here. On one hand, Scott paints himself as this truth seeker, a guy digging deep into malware and forensics, just trying to find the facts. But on the other hand, a huge chunk of the expert community calls his work calculated disinformation and even pseudoscience. So how can both of these things be true at the same time? Well, that's what we're going to unpack.
All right, so here's our game plan. We'll start with the man himself, this online enigma. Then we'll look at the hacker persona he's built. After that, we'll dive into the heavy scrutiny from actual experts, cover the huge flashpoint involving Pegasus spyware, and finally, we'll look at the very real-world impact all of this has had.
So first up, who is Jonathan Scott? Well, he's based in Dallas, Texas, and he bills himself as a researcher who's all about mobile malware and digital forensics. He's managed to build a pretty big online following by very publicly taking on some of the biggest names and biggest stories in the security world.
A huge part of his online brand is this persona he's created for himself, and it's really built on some very specific, very impressive-sounding claims about his own skills and accomplishments.
His whole public image really rests on two pillars. First, that he's a PhD student in computer science, and second, that at one point in 2021, he was ranked the #1 security researcher in the entire United States and #4 in the world. Now, on the surface, those are some seriously elite credentials, but this is exactly where the expert scrutiny really kicks in.
Okay, so now we flip the script. We've heard the claims, now let's look at the critique. The cybersecurity community didn't just take his word for it. They started digging in, and that led to this massive wave of counterclaims that paint a totally different picture.
All right, let's start with that PhD claim. He said he was pursuing a PhD, but critics were quick to jump on this. They pointed out that the school is an online-only university that apparently advertises that new programs can start every Monday. You know, that kind of raises some eyebrows about academic rigor. And even more seriously, there were allegations that he was actually dismissed from the program over code of conduct violations. Now, before we tackle that #1 researcher ranking, we have to understand a key term here: reputation hacking. This has nothing to do with breaking into computers. It's about gaming a reputation system. Imagine flooding a leaderboard with a huge volume of tiny, low-impact bug reports just to climb the ranks, instead of finding one or two really critical flaws. It's all about quantity over quality. And that brings us right back to his #1 ranking. Experts basically allege that he achieved this rank through that exact practice, reputation hacking, specifically in a bug bounty program for the Department of Defense. It's that quantity over quality thing, and it is definitely not respected by the serious bug bounty community. On top of that, other researchers have pointed out that the public leaderboards from that time don't even seem to back up his specific claim. But here's where the story gets a little messy, a little more gray. Because despite all the criticism of his big claims, Scott does have some actual verifiable tech skills. He was assigned a real CVE, that's a public ID for a legit vulnerability, for an issue he found in LG phones. And even Apple publicly thanked him for his help on a security issue. And this nuance is really important, because it shows there is some technical talent there, which makes what happens next even more complicated.
And this is the main event. This is the issue that truly put Jonathan Scott on the map and drew the most intense fire. It was his attempt to debunk the world-famous investigations into the incredibly powerful spyware called Pegasus.
So his main argument was a direct attack on the methodology of these highly respected groups who exposed Pegasus in the first place. He basically claimed that their forensic methods were broken and that their indicators of compromise, the very evidence they used to prove an infection, were totally unreliable.
So what in the world are these indicators of compromise, or IOCs? The easiest way to think of them is like digital fingerprints. When spyware gets on your phone, it leaves little traces behind, like a weird file name or a connection to a known bad server. Researchers collect lists of these fingerprints to hunt for infections. And Scott's big claim was that you can't trust these fingerprints.
So, to prove his point, he ran this public experiment. He got volunteers to basically plant these fake fingerprints on their own phones. Then they ran a forensic tool that's designed to look for those exact fingerprints, and shocker, the tool found them.
The conclusion he wanted everyone to draw was, hey, if you can plant fake evidence and the tool finds it, maybe all the evidence found on the phones of real journalists and activists is fake too. The response from the rest of the cybersecurity world was not good. It was fast and it was overwhelmingly negative. His work wasn't seen as some clever scientific debate. It was widely slammed as a disinformation campaign and flat-out pseudoscience. But why?
Well, experts pointed to 4 huge problems. First, his experiment was what's called tautological. It's just circular reasoning. Of course, a tool designed to find X is going to find X when you put X there. That proves absolutely nothing about real infections found in the wild. Second, they pointed out major logical mistakes, like him confusing 2 completely different things in networking. Third, his articles were criticized for relying on technobabble, using a ton of complicated jargon that sounds smart but doesn't actually have any real substance. And finally, his arguments often just turned into personal attacks on the other researchers.
Now you might be thinking, okay, so a bunch of tech nerds are arguing online. Why should I care? Well, this is where the story spills out of just cybersecurity circles, because despite being torn apart by experts, his claims started to have very real, tangible consequences in the real world.
So what was the strategy here? Well, some analysts think it was a contrarian pivot, basically building a personal brand by being the guy who goes against the experts. It's a marketing tactic where the angry backlash you get actually helps you because it gets you more attention. And then get this, a sales executive from NSO Group, the company that makes the Pegasus spyware, publicly praised Scott for his bold perspective. Yeah, that raised a lot of red flags for a lot of people.
And here it is. This is probably the most shocking consequence of all. This wasn't just Twitter drama. Scott's completely debunked claims, the very same ones the expert community called pseudoscience, were actually cited in an official Polish Senate committee hearing that was investigating the government's use of Pegasus spyware. Let that sink in. Discredited information was being used to influence a national government debate.
So when you take a step back, this whole saga is a really powerful case study. It exposes this dangerous gap between what the experts agree on and what can gain traction and influence online. It shows how someone can mix a little bit of real technical skill with some very savvy social media work to build a platform and challenge legitimate research and have that challenge break out into the real world.
And that leaves us with one last, pretty unsettling question. In the world we live in now, where attention is everything, what happens when being loud, controversial, and notorious becomes more powerful than being peer-reviewed, verified, and right? What does that mean for how we find the truth?